drinking my mushroom coffee from Rise. I like it. If Rise wants to sponsor our podcast, you already have a customer.
If Shure Microphones wants to sponsor our podcast.
Rise and Shore.
Perfect combination.
Yeah, Sure Rise sounds like a Viagra alternative.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Hello and welcome to the Technically Friends podcast hosted by Harrison Wolf and Timothy Reuter. My name is Harrison, and today's episode kicks off Season 2. Season 1 brought some truly inspiring folks from across the technology world, and I'm really excited about the next few episodes. If you've listened to us before, you know that the reason Timothy and I created this podcast was to find a way to highlight the amazing people we've met in our professional or scholastic careers. They're folks with deep expertise and some intersection between technology and society, and who continue to achieve success in their field as key players across business and government sectors or launching their own efforts to drive positive change. Today continues the trend of bringing together an impact-focused approach to a tech career while maintaining a focus on principles, ethics, and morals. Today's guest is someone Timothy and I both admire greatly for her unyielding dedication to advancing equality, ensuring individual rights, and advocating for positive uses for technology. Sheila Warren, who has carried titles such as head of blockchain at the World Economic Forum, CEO of Project Liberty, CEO and founder of the Crypto Council for Innovation, lawyer and board member for ACLU in California, and mother to 3 girls, sits at the crossroads of technology, trust, and what we all seek, power. She's a leading voice in the world of digital governance and spends much of her time working to rethink how the internet itself should work for people, not just platforms. She's advised governments, shaped global policy conversations, and isn't afraid to ask the uncomfortable questions about who really benefits in our digital future. Smart, clear-eyed, and refreshingly honest, this is a conversation you don't want to miss. Sheila, it's truly great to have you with us today. Welcome.
Hey, you too. Wow. Thanks so much for that really generous intro. It's so good to see you both. I'm excited about this.
You look great. We're happy to have you. Tears of the Patriarchy mug in hand. Perfect.
Yes, indeed.
I don't think the patriarchy's crying right now, though.
No,
I think,
they're really not. It's quite
unfortunately
empty, as it turns
delighted.
out.
Yes.
It's really a very empty mug. Yes, it's more of a anticipatory mug than an actual. Yes, indeed.
It's about time that the billionaire white man, have a good life and do well.
I really
Was
think
finally
it's their
able to
time.
get the recognition that they
It's
deserve.
their time. It's just their time. It's their time.
It's wonderful to bring the band back together. I have really wonderful memories of working in those buildings, in San Francisco in nature. You're best known now for your work on cryptocurrency and blockchain. Can you tell us the story about how you came to see these technologies as a powerful tool for social change?
Absolutely, and thanks for asking. I'm expecting you. I expect at some point, Timothy, you will burst into song, as you tended to do when we work together. So I'm just putting that out there into the world, manifest it. Yeah. So I have a long and windy career arc, I think, like all 3 of us do. And for me, the aha moment around blockchain technology was when I was general counsel of a social enterprise called TechSoup in San Francisco. And so TechSoup, long story short, I'd built a product there called NGO Source that was meant to kind of help matchmake small nonprofits with U.S. foundations and DAFs, like big philanthropic donors, to help them locate these smaller organizations. Okay, and through the course of that work, a lot of activist organizations entered the database. And this is true at TechSoup in general and also at NGO Source. And our CTO one day let me know that we were seeing an increase in hacking attempts on our servers, primarily, and the assumption was because of these activists' information. And this is a situation where, of course, the security is of paramount importance. People will be disappeared or even killed, if or both this information gets out. And so at one point, we actually pulled some of this data out of the cloud and really tried to delete it as much as we could, right? Which is an interesting question at this time. We're talking like 2015. We put it in like a files cabinet, like paper, just to have, the records we needed for this funding to go through because of IRS documentation, et cetera. We didn't have a choice of not getting the data, but what do we do with it? So around that time, somebody I know mentioned blockchain to me pretty casually. Oh, this thing called blockchain, it's a different kind of ledger. It's more secure. It's tamper proof, et cetera, et cetera. And I did not know what that was. It was tied to Bitcoin, which at the time I believed was criminal money. Okay, to give you a sense of how far I've come and in my journey. And so I was a little resistant, but then this person said there's this new thing called Ethereum that has just been launched recently, and it is really more focused on data than on money. And I said, well, that sounds very interesting. So I got very, very fascinated by Ethereum technology, by the Ethereum blockchain, and kind of took it from there. And, 2 years later, I wound up at the forum, founding the blockchain team.
Wow. That's quite a journey. Question: Tech Soup, did that come before or after Talk Soup? Because I remember watching Talk Soup, the comedic show
So, yeah,
on
great
Bravo
question.
or something. I forget where
So,
it came from.
it's a great question. TechSoup had it was called CompuMentor in '87 when it was founded. I don't know when they changed the name to TechSoup before I got there. And I have to say, I was like, what is this soup? The logo is like, it was a cup of soup. And I was very confused. But then I realized it actually is a really good image for what
Mm,
that organization does, which is educate nonprofits about technology, which is a myriad hodgepodge of things. And if you're not a technologist and you're a 2-person, 3-person nonprofit trying to serve, a population that's also not very tech savvy or tech literate even, or
hmm
has no access, it does feel very complicated and, confusing and all mashed together. So anyhow, yeah, I don't know. Good question. That was a great show.
Now, in a world where you have come so far, you said, from a place where Bitcoin is no longer just money for pirates or however you want to frame it. There are still a number of folks who would characterize it that way, right? Or are skeptical of it. How do you convince somebody, or how do you talk to that person to say, look, I'm not going to try to, persuade you 100%, but consider these things as to why Bitcoin actually might be important, more so than just as for smuggling money across borders or
Yeah.
laundering money.
Yeah, so I've told you my origin story into the blockchain world, which was not about fintech or financial services at all, right? And what really changed my mind about Bitcoin, and look, every technology has pros and cons. Let's be clear, okay? And so I'm not a Bitcoin evangelist. It's like Bitcoin forever. It's the number one, but there was no question. And even what I said at the forum back in like 2018 was like Bitcoin has a very narrow but very sticky use case, and that remains true today. Okay, the things that Bitcoin is, I think, helpful for in terms of equity, financial access, those things are still true. And there really isn't an alternative to Bitcoin that has emerged despite, a generation of
Hmm
attempts at fintech innovation. Okay. And what are those
hmm
use cases? Hyperinflationary economies, for example, the ease and efficiency and speed of passing through things like currency pairs. Okay. Things like this, to some extent, remittances. Now, what has evolved over time in parallel with Bitcoin are other forms of digital currencies that I would argue are similarly adept at these use cases. But at the time, that was not true. None of these
hmm
things, there was no USDC, none of that existed. So one thing we did before I left the forum back in 22 was we landed this paper, actually it was earlier than that even. It was I started this thing called the Global Digital Currency Governance Consortium. And the idea there was to really articulate the differences between what's called a central bank digital currency, which is fiat that's on a ledger or not, right? Stable coins, which are pegged to an extrinsic asset, and cryptocurrencies, which have their own intrinsic value, like Bitcoin. Those are different things.
mm
But at the time, back in 2015, 16, 17, there really was Bitcoin, and that was kind of it. So it really started with what is the thing we're trying to do? Okay. And so
mm
for me, the thing I'm trying to do is always increase access, close gaps, create again like a more level playing field in the world. And whether that's about access to money and investment opportunities or whatever it is, or whether it's about data storage, access, safety and security, all these things, or whether it's about surveillance technology, all these things are of critical importance that there be access from everybody, every human being in the world. I think technology there's a right to access. And so
mm.
Bitcoin did provide that access to people and still does in certain parts of the world where other forms of money or monetary system are not as available.
Yeah, we're in a moment where there's a lot of geopolitical chaos, to say the least. So,
Yeah.
how does cryptocurrency, how is it helping right now in a place like Venezuela, which is going through a particularly extreme political transition?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not going to speak to Venezuela specifically because I know too much and too little. So the things I would say are not not for prime time about
Okay.
Venezuelan use case. But I do think, imagine, let's just conjure up a hypo. Let's imagine a society where the ability of the government to control who has access to financial services is very high. Okay. So if you want to go, buy groceries, you have to use the government's rails, their financial system, essentially, which are called, the rails there, and they can track you. They know what you're doing. They know where you are. They know what you're buying. This is not a world, by the way, that is like dystopian nightmare. This is like a very real thing, okay, that could happen and is happening in some parts of the world. So what if you needed to do a thing that was illicit? Now let's remember, what's illicit? Well, it's what a government decides is illicit. What's a crime? It's what
Mm-hmm.
a government decides is a crime. Now, most of us would agree certain things, murder, mayhem, these things are crimes and they're bad. But there are other things, protesting. Is that a crime?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're in a moment right now where I guess it remains to be seen. It depends who's asking, which is a
Mm-hmm.
mess. It cannot depend who's asking. So imagine if you had to buy supplies to go to a protest in this country where anything you did that was a purchase could be tracked. Would you or would you not want the ability to engage in a transaction, a financial transaction, in a way that was not traceable by those people or those parties? So these are the use cases I think about and I'm talking about when we're talking about the need for alternative financial rails in any political economy. Okay. So another thing I said back in the day was, listen, in the United States, where we generally speaking have a pretty privileged a pretty privileged population, relatively speaking, to the rest of the world when it comes to the financial system. Okay. Now,
Mm-hmm.
again, I think it's really important to anchor that is certainly not universally true. There are plenty of people here who have to go to payday lenders. All kinds of nonsense happens to get access to money that you earned. Everyone would agree that you earned it, but the slice that's taken out of it for you to get access to those funds is pretty bananas. Okay, it's pretty crazy. But for most people in America, the financial system works well enough. And some of the things that were blatantly discriminatory have largely been fixed, I would argue. Okay, redlining, at least you can't do it blatantly. It still happens all the time, but you can't do it like as a policy of your bank, right? As an example, okay? You can get credit, these things are still a mess, but like generally speaking, in other parts of the world, that's absolutely not true. And it's not true at an individual level, at a country level, right? At a community level and a country level. So in some parts of the world, your racial background means you cannot get a bank account because the system that controls that is discriminating against you, and that is kind of implicitly sanctioned by whoever's in power. You individually might have a mark against you. Okay, and I will say this as a brown person, ask anyone named Muhammad after 9/11 if they were able to get on an airplane very easily, okay? Whether or not that was them or not. Like,
Mm-hmm.
individually, it could affect you fairly or unfairly. A community level, because of your demographic characterizations, and at a country level. So in the world, there's still this thing called debanking that happens, where countries at a country level are deemed too risky for money to flow through or in. And banks just don't bank there, which is
Yeah.
wild.
With Somalia being probably the most famous example. Yeah.
Alternative financial rails are critical to even get you to the starting place in the global economy. And we forget about this a lot in the West. Or I mean, not even in the West, in like more privileged, wealthier countries that have financial systems that generally function okay. We forget about all of this. And we shouldn't forget about it. And it's not just unbanked, right? It's all kinds of other people that, again, at this individual, community, and country level, are just cut off from access to these systems. And I find that to be an absolute travesty, and it's not necessary. And digital currencies are part of the reason it's not necessary because there is more universal accessibility.
I would say this episode is going to have two themes. One is power, which we've been talking about, and the other one is career. So turning a little bit to career, tell us about the thought process in going from being a lawyer at TechSoup to being a not lawyer at the World Economic Forum.
Yeah. So, so it's so funny because I had these two stints as a lawyer. Okay. So I came out of Harvard Law and I went to Cravath, which for any lawyers listening, people call it the Death Star. Okay. That's the nickname of this firm. I mean, literally, you work really hard. It's lots of hours. I actually really loved that experience for two reasons. One is I wasn't going to stay. So I wasn't trying to play politics internally at all. I was there to pay off my law school debt. I had, a number. When I hit the number, I was like, I can go. So it was a very, and it was fascinating to be in those rooms at that age, 24, 25, whatever I was. And I was in the back, in the room during these gigantic multi-billion-dollar mergers, hearing as counsel what people actually cared about. What were the concerns? What were the things that were sticking points in these combinations of gigantic companies, household name companies, or divorces of those companies, depending on the case, right? I was in the room during board fights. And so it was just really, really interesting watching to bring the themes together, the power dynamics play out in those rooms at that age, right? With no agenda, but just learning. And I don't even think I realized how much I learned until I sat on my first board,
Mm.
about how some of that works. Okay. So when I hit the number, I left and I wanted to go back into philanthropy. And so there were two firms at the time that focused on philanthropy clients, one in San Francisco and one in DC. I had been pretty clear DC was not for me. I didn't really want to live there. I didn't kind of like the vibe as much. I knew one person in San Francisco. But I basically chased down a law firm partner who worked at the firm in San Francisco at a conference and asked her if she would, be willing to talk to me about how I could be more marketable to a firm like hers. Long story short, she wound up giving me a job offer, and I moved to San Francisco, with kind of knowing hardly anyone, and started this job at that company. And that's where the idea for me of what became NGO Source emerged. So I left the law the first time because for two reasons. One, bluntly, I just hated being a law firm lawyer. I just hated it. I hated tracking my hours and my time. I hated feeling commodified in that way. I felt very constrained. There's not a lot of group work that happens in that kind of law. And so it was me sitting in my beautiful, gorgeous, stunning office in the Ferry Building in San Francisco, staring at this gorgeous, whatever it was, and feeling just stuck and unhappy because I was very, very, it just wasn't a good fit in terms of the style of practice for me. I'm much more collaborative, which I hadn't thought about. I didn't realize it in those terms. I just knew I didn't like it. So I left that job without a job because I was just like, I can't do this anymore. And I have to go figure out what I want to do. I took some clients with me to pay the rent, frankly. And over the course of that time, I had this idea, it's really not fair that these big, giant nonprofits get all the funding and all the money. Weirdly, I should back up. Weirdly, I had backed into this weird position where I was one of like the 5 lawyers in the country who was an expert on how to get money into India, philanthropic dollars into India, which was very complicated at the time and remains. And so I was doing a lot of advising of like South Asian clients who wanted to send money into India and like how to do that and all that. But I was like, they're sending it to the same groups over and over and over and over and over again. But there's so many nonprofits that are doing, frankly, better and more targeted and more relevant, right? And more grassroots work than like the Red Cross or whatever it is. Like, why are we doing this? Simultaneously, a group of other people had had a similar revelation from an administrative point of view that they were wasting a lot of money vetting the same organizations over and over and over and over again. And if there would only be some kind of library that would source these organizations, then they could all take advantage of it. So these efforts wound up converging, and I wound up running what became NGO Source. So I left the law completely to become a product builder. Having never, I had coded my own website in college. I was very tech savvy, but I was not a computer scientist or anything like that. And there's a really funny story about this because there was a team that was working on this and their engineers, and I had to come in as their new leader and kind of convince them that I wasn't like a complete idiot, which I knew the subject, I knew the problem really, really well, better than anybody in that room, but I didn't know how to build a thing, okay? And this was when GChat was a thing. So first of all, the whole idea that you'd walk into a meeting room and a laptop would be open, like lawyers don't do that. You're taking hand notes, you're giving your full attention to the client, but like everyone in tech is just like, blah, 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 So that was like wild to me. But I was like, well, if they're doing that, I'll take advantage of it. And I literally had my husband, my at the time boyfriend, now husband, who's a computer scientist, on GChat with me, on Google Chat, which was pretty new. And I'm like, okay, I don't know what to ask these people. Like, what do I say to them to sound vaguely competent? And he was like sending me, he's like, these are 4 questions you could ask. Okay. So I'm asking them a question.
He was your Chat GPT.
Not even kidding, right? Only it was like it was this guy. So it was my husband. And so he's like Cyranoing in my ear, right? And so here's my favorite story about how far I've come. Is so he had me read this like article on product management, and I absorbed maybe like a tenth of it. I don't know what the hell I was talking about, But he's like, I said, okay. And they were clearly testing me because it was like, there was a gender dynamic here too. Okay. It was a bunch of dudes and here's me. Okay. And they say, we're an agile shop. I don't know what the hell that means. Okay. I have no idea. I'm like, is this like some yoga thing? I'm like, what the hell? So I typed to him. I'm like, they're an agile shop. He's like, ask how long their sprint cycle is. So I'm like, how long is your sprint cycle? And they're like, oh, wow, we had a 4-week sprint cycle and 2 weeks. And we were just off to the races. That was it. Off to the races, right? Wow. And I told the lead engineer this like a year later. I was like, that was the thing. And he's like, that is hilarious. And he's like, look, I mean, you pulled it off for one thing. So good on you. But also like, we were being kind of jerks. We were kind of doing it on purpose to sort of be not, whatever, right? Throw me off a little. And so it was this hilarious moment where I'm like, look, you just take advantage of the resources that you have and do the best you can. And then I very quickly, of course, had to spend a ton of time learning, like, how do you build a product? How do you design? How do you test for customer satisfaction? All of that I learned while doing. So it was, as our colleague Vika would say, building the plane while flying it. Well, my learning about how to build a product, right? Which is not an uncommon story. Many builders or founders in the Valley come with a problem and they don't know how to instantiate it. And they have to hire an engineering team and figure out, are they actually solving the problem that I'm seeing, right? And how are they not? And how do we iterate and all of that? So I had to do that live. And eventually in 2013, we launched that product. And to this day, I'm really proud of it. It still exists as back-end infrastructure for everything. But anyhow, so I had left the law once before. Okay, to get to your question, because it's a very long-winded answer to your question. I got caught in my own narrative. It's very interesting. I haven't told the story in a long time. So as I built that and launched it, the CEO of that company, of TechSoup, Rebecca Massasak, came to me and said, look, would you come and be our inaugural general counsel? You have a law degree. I trust you. You understand product now. You've been in this company for a bit. You've kind of seen some of the ways we work and whatnot. And so I agreed, went on maternity leave, came back as a lawyer again. So all over again, I was a lawyer, but this time I was in-house, never having intended to be a lawyer again. I did that for another, 5 years. And so for me, leaving the law, I had left the law once before, to get to your question. So leaving the law, less leaving because the work we did at the forum, I used my law degree every single day, I would say,
Mm.
in terms of thinking about these interventions and governance and all those things. But of course, we had no clients there, right? But leaving the law again was not as hard for me at that time. I didn't have like any agita about it because I'm like, oh, I could always come back if I wanted. There's precedent. But also, okay, I've done this all the ways. I've been a law firm lawyer. I've been an in-house lawyer. I liked the in-house much better than the law firm, but I was still feeling stuck because as a lawyer, you're still an advisor.
Mm.
And I wanted to go back to being the one that was building.
What did you learn from working at the World Economic Forum? And specifically, looking back, what do you see as the opportunities and limitations of these kinds of private sector-led platforms for social change?
What an excellent question. I'm dying to hear what you two would say about this too. I think one thing I'll frame up is, I think we were at the forum at a very unique moment in its history. Okay. And
Mm.
so the forum as it is today and as it was before the San Francisco C4IR, office was organized is a different place. And so I'll restrict my comments to kind of my experience, which I think we all could agree was a very unique and defined experiment that the forum was
Mhm.
doing. And how do we, whether it's the do tank that we were, not the think tank, the do tank or whatever it was, we had a very different orientation. And so what I learned, I learned so much about collaboration, consensus building, and what I now call intersectional technologies. And so the opportunity to be in that office in San Francisco with people like you two working on drones. I knew nothing about drones. I arguably still know nothing about drones, but I know a lot more than I did before. I still know nothing about precision medicine, by the way, like a lot less about drones, harder to access, but like digital trade, having all of those verticals, if you will, in the same place was so generative.
Mm.
And just the cross collaboration we were able to do, even if it didn't lead to formal projects or outputs or whatnot, but just kind of like the learning, because the reality is, right, technology does not exist in a silo. And we talk a lot in our society about tech as if tech is somehow divorced from our lives or from our realities, and it's not. Right? And so one of the things I'm objecting to a lot these days is that the AI vertical, AI is a horizontal. AI is like, it's running across everything. Like you can't, yes, there are businesses being built in AI, but AI itself is completely a vertical, it's a horizontal to everything. The way you'd
Mhm.
have like a security layer, you're going to have an AI layer in your tech stack. And that is like insight that is probably really obvious to computer scientists, but someone like me, who came at this a little differently, it was really instructive to understand the connectivity of everything. And then the forum itself layered in the geopolitics, right? And the business realities and all of that context. And I think what we were constantly doing was having to pull and having to examine our areas of expertise within a broader context. And that is something hardly anyone gets to do or does, let alone does effectively. And that was our job. So to me, I took away that I bring that to everything I do. I'm always looking around to be like, what am I missing? What's the context in which this development is happening? How is that related to other things? How is it not related? How should it be related? How should I think about what's happening in US China trade relations, in the context of digital currencies? That's a really obvious one, I would think, but like not to everybody, right? So all these things are connected. And this, I would say, this insight has served me extraordinarily well. In fact, I've kind of almost made like a brand around kind of being a person who was always contextualizing things, right?
Mm,
And I was naturally prone to do that. But the access to information and the encouragement of that systems thinking, as the forum calls it, and kind of almost training us in that, right? And honing that skill is something that I think is incredibly valuable. And I would argue that is actually the value that public-private partnerships and these kinds of institutions bring to bear, is the ability they have to frame up and understand context and apply that to any individual problem.
Yeah, I love that framing, and I agree. I mean, I both enjoyed and am proud of the work that I was able and we were able to do at that time, and that, after a while, I was no longer able to do that work in that context.
Okay.
I mean, nothing nefarious, but it just wasn't lining up with the business model.
Yeah, that's right. It was an
And
experiment.
that's when it
It
was
was an
time
experiment.
mhm.
to move
That's
on,
right.
and that's fine. I have nothing but, positive regard and positive feelings. I'd love to hear you. So, I mean, you talked a lot about sort of what you learned and the positive things that were enabled. What did you find to be the limitations of the ability to affect social change through that kind of platform?
Yeah, it's a great question. So by the time I left, I ran the SF office and I ran a number of different teams, and one of which was the Tech Pioneers team, which is the startup community, right? And one of our good friends and colleagues ran that, and I was her, I oversaw that team, let's say. And something that she and her team and I, fought really hard for, that we got zero resistance around, was geographically expanding that group, right? And saying we need to be thinking about entrepreneurs from all over the world. But as time went on, and I've noticed this as well, is you move from like unicorn to decacorn framing, right? At the end of the day, I think there is a limitation in, it's not the money, because I think there are plenty of organizations engaged at the forum that are not wealthy organizations, right? They are smaller or civil society or whatnot. But there was almost a requirement of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, fame is not the right word. No, not notoriety. That's bad. But like, just public awareness. You had to kind of be almost a household name. So a lot of it
Mhm.
became how much PR you done in advance of getting to the forum. And I saw that evolve. Again, I share your view, Timothy, that I'm very proud of the work that we did. Really, I'm so grateful I got to work there, and it was such an amazing experience for me, one of a formative experience for me for sure. But it's something I observed over time, and it became more and more difficult to get smaller, less well known, right,
Mm.
organizations. And part of what I want to do, so for example, in 2019, I brought the Premier of Bermuda, to Davos. And that was a pretty easy ask, to be honest. I didn't have to like pull any, a few years later, I tried to bring somebody else similarly small, and it was absolutely shot down because that was
Mm.
not the moment, right? And so we had this window where I think and I think we were hired actually because we were very justice minded, and there was a through line in
Mhm.
that office around that. And so a lot of us were trying to elevate voices that were not ordinarily getting these kinds of stages or awareness or anything like that, right? And I think that was a very conscious thing I was trying to do. And over time, it became harder and harder because the PR awareness you kind of had to have, whether by luck or design or whatever, became more and more difficult for smaller organizations to achieve. And I found that challenging for sure, for sure.
So I have a very similar remembrance of sort of the work that we've done, but I would take it in a slightly different direction. One of the things that I think I'm coming to terms with is the idea that the thesis that these technologies that we're evolving in a very decentralized way. You can think of distributed ledgers or blockchain. You can think of drones, you know, democratizing airspace and enabling the future of aviation to be from the ground up and encompassing many more people on the ground than traditionally, people had interacted with aviation. Um, in reality, have really not led to the decentralization and power disruption that we expected to see.
100%.
And so I'm wondering, what do you think? was wrong about the original thesis? Or, how do you see this moving forward? Is there a way to ensure we see an accountability so more people can get involved and this has the positive impact we are hoping to achieve?
What a question, Harrison. So there's this really a funny but painful meme that every now and then surfaces in the crypto community, which is the Drake meme, where he's like doing the thing. So the first one is like, traditional finance, and then it's like decentralized finance, and then it's like re-centralized finance.
Yeah.
And I occasionally tweet it or whatever we call it now. I mean, I'm not even on X anymore, thank God. But I occasionally I think about that a lot because I'm
Mhm,
like, okay, what I have seen again being in the Valley now for 20 years is that money corrupts. Even more than power corrupts, money corrupts. It just corrupts.
mhm,
And so let me like again give you a long answer and get there because I'm thinking out loud, but it's a great question. So when I first moved here to the Valley and I was a philanthropy lawyer, like I said, that was a generation where the kind of model was kind of the Carnegie, Rockefeller model. You make a bunch of money doing a thing that's like, versus that, whatever, right? And then you feel really bad and then you give a bunch of it back in ways, okay? Whatever the ways are. And if you were at that time, if you were East Coast philanthropy, it was like the symphony, the library, the whatever. Out here, we started the whole field of impact investing, impact metrics. It was like, Pear and Palma Midyar were early clients of mine. Funnily enough, Peter Thiel was an early client of that firm and of mine. And so the question was like, how do we give back in a way that we can measure that this is making a difference? Bill Gates kind of pioneered this with the
mhm,
malaria, right? He was like, well, how do we know malaria is decreasing and what is the metric? What's going to move it? It didn't have to be sexy. It had to be effective. At least that was the conceit at the time. Okay. Now, let me tell you, nobody cares. Okay. So I had a conversation with a couple of crypto billionaires and they were leaving their roles and whatever, and we are having this discussion like, what are you going to do next? And and normally it would be, I'm going to go buy land and then give back to the community in some fashion, or I'm going to like solve the problem of housing or whatever it is. These guys were like, we're going to go focus on longevity. And I laughed in their faces because I could do that because we knew each other. But I'm like, this is what it's become, right? It's a very different frame because I think the conceit of technology that I have always found problematic and troubling is that by building the technology, I have given such a gift to the world, such a gift that was my contribution. Right? I have
mm,
done it. So my crypto exchange is so important that I have like done the thing, or or even YouTube. That is such an amazing thing that was built and without recognition that there are pros and cons to all of this. I mean, yes, we can Arab Spring, but also we can, body dysmorphia. You know what I'm saying? Like pros and
Yeah,
cons, right?
yeah,
It's
yeah.
like so, and there
It's a great
isn't
way to
really,
put it.
I don't see a wrestling or a reckoning, with that reality. And there's either like denial of it, or there's like the well, tech is neutral and people do it that is not my responsibility or fault in any fashion. If they take it and do bad things with it, well, I just put a tool out there. It's a hammer. It's a hammer, right? The context matters.
Mhm,
Right? Now we're not gonna get into social media, we can, but, like, that's a whole different building addiction into your engine is a totally different thing than not, right? But, like, there's these elements of this, and so, I think your question, Harrison, is, like, how do we it isn't and I actually have never really believed that decentralization was the goal. I thought
mhm,
disintermediation of power. I'm very anti-monopoly. I think that is very important, right? But I always kind of assumed there would be again, to go back to the meme, a re-centralization of power as the money became a corrupting influence.
mm,
Because like you watch a company go public and suddenly you have shareholders, right? And you have accountability to your shareholders. And everybody would agree, every good corporate lawyer would agree, that is your responsibility. Your responsibility is to protect the stock price so your shareholders are not somehow screwed or whatever. Like that's your fund. More before, when you're private, your responsibility is what? To your users, to your customers, that's your primary responsibility, right? How do you have to suddenly balance this new? So you see it happen over and over and over and over and over again. And I think it is less about the power, frankly, than I think it is about following the money.
mm,
Don't even get me started on venture investors. So you have venture come in, they have expectations. They, in some cases, set the table. They come
mhm,
in, they have the board seat, they make demands. There's a lot of this. Like, who are you most accountable to? So it's one thing I just tell, younger people that I mentor, and they're like, I want to take this job. I'm like, who is most hurt financially if that thing goes awry? Because you need to understand that through line, right? Is it the founder? Is it the board? Is it the users? Like, who is it? Because that is who you are ultimately working on behalf of more than anybody else, right? Now, you didn't ask me why I have somewhat moved away from crypto, which I have. Okay. And it's a
Would
great question.
love to hear that
Yeah.
story. Yeah.
Oh, happy to talk about the stories. In the summer of 24, there was, so I agreed to take the position at the Crypto Council of Innovation as founding CEO, built the whole team. And we can talk about how I built that team because I think there's interesting career and leadership questions in there as well. Uh, but because I wanted to be an evidence-based advocacy organization. And from the very beginning, that was the line. We are an evidence-based advocacy organization, which means I'm not going to spew some hypey nonsense, which has been happening over and over and over again about this technology. It does a thing, it doesn't do another thing. It could do some things, it doesn't yet, right? We're going to be very evidence-based. Here's what it does, here's what it doesn't do. Here are the problems, here are the challenges, here are the blah, 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 blah. And we were going to document the heck out of everything. We're not going to say a thing if we can't prove it. And so very quickly, which speaks to the industry, I would say, or to tech in general, very quickly, we became an absolutely credible authority because people would stress test what I was saying or what the team was saying, and it was right every time. Like, it was unassailable, right? There were just facts here. And when we didn't know, we would be honest. That is still evolving. There's not a clear answer. It depends how you look at it. Like, we would just nuance it. And I had no problem doing that because it's authentic and it's honest, right? And to me, I was like, you're not going to land. So I should say what CCI is. CCI is an association that was there to get policy and regulation landed that, in my opinion, would benefit industry and consumers. It was both ways, okay? Because I really believed that, again, for all the reasons we talked about, alternative rails are important. Digital currencies were really important. Not only that, they weren't going anywhere. Whether you like them or not, they had to be wrestled with, right? Like, these are not vanishing. And there was a movement, this became very political. There's a movement out of Washington to say, we'll just dismiss all of that. That's all nonsense. It'll just vanish if we somehow don't pay attention to it, which is insane. Okay, this is wrong. And sure enough, here we are, okay? So moving ahead, 3 years in, we got a bill through the House. We were instrumental in getting a broad coalition of organizations to get together. We got a bipartisan vote on the bill, which no one told me that we were going to be able to do. To the extent we did it because we went in like painstakingly and made the case to every single congressperson. Here's why this matters to your constituents. Here's why it's important. Here are the pros and cons. Here's why regulating it is important. Here's why regulating it now is important. Here's why regulating it in this way. All the things, right? It was just like a lot. It's a ton of this kind of like building this consensus. We got that through the House. We had a bill in the Senate ready to go. We had bipartisan, we had willingness to take it all the way up to Leader Schumer. This is, again, remember the previous regime when we had Democrats in power. And we had agreement from all the major industry players, consumer groups. Everybody was like, okay, this thing is a good enough bill, which is all you ever get. And then some elements within industry, CCI-oriented, other folks, went to candidate Trump at the time, and he gave this talk in Bitcoin Nashville, which you can listen to if you want to know how things went the way they went. That was very well received by parts of the industry, and some people decided that, like, he was it. He was going to be the guy that was going to get the industry every single thing it wanted. Therefore, we had to wait until he got elected and hold off on any legislation.
And isn't that correct? Was that a correct bet?
No.
Okay.
Because I will tell you why, but no. It turns out no, and also no, okay? So people at the time would ask me, who's better? I got asked on Bloomberg, actually, on live TV, who is better for crypto, Trump or Biden at the time? Trump or Biden? And I said, listen, it depends if you take a long-term or short-term view. Short term, definitely Trump, no question. Trump is going to, get new heads of the agencies at the SEC and CFTC, right? He's going to stop some of these, frankly, like ridiculous lawsuits that were issued against companies that really didn't have any merit, in my opinion. Actually, I think that's fact, I would say, at this point. These things are going to happen, right? But over time, how is he going to land this technology and industry? Is it going to be everyone's excited about it and everyone's like, that sounds great? Or is it going to be some weird, contorted, distorted?
I mean, by starting his own company that then gives him a personal stake in all of it.
That's right. And so my view, I always saw that my role from the very beginning of when I moved full time into this space in 2017 at the Forum was to normalize it and demystify it and make people less afraid of it. And I'm like, how is that going to play? With somebody who has no qualms about, leveraging the technology for personal gain, okay, just put it out there. Like, how is that going to play over the longer term for this industry if we want to be taken seriously? And I did not think that was good. I also agree with many industry actors that the Biden administration took a very, to this day, incredibly bizarre and unproductive approach to this technology, just in the sheer denial of its existence and stickiness, right? Which was just Delulu. I mean, there was no world in which this was going to go away. And all you were doing was like pissing off. It was a really small market share. Like, you know what I mean? They didn't have the power at that time. And that resulted in all of this PAC money and this and that and da 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 da. Okay. So there is like, again, it's a symbiotic, contextualized relationship. Okay. Now, here's the funny thing. So I told my board, and then the Harris switch came in, so I was like, okay, this is more promising than under Biden. So now I feel like maybe there's some hope here. Anyhow, long story short, I told my board before the election, no matter who wins this election, Trump or Harris, you should assume I will not be here after inauguration. So and here's some options for a plan. Let's make a plan. And so ultimately, I think they were really shocked that the election happened. And the day after, there was a lot of shock in industry that I still wanted to go. It was a shock because we're going to get everything we want. Don't you want to take credit for those wins? You've worked so hard. The organization's amazing. And I was like, no, none of that matters to me. I came here to do a thing. I don't think I can do that thing under a Trump administration.
And what was the thing?
The thing was to land this technology in a way that was focused on democratizing access to financial services and technology, and also landing the plane on financial services so that we could go back to, remember, my initial reason I got into it in the first place, which was around data. I was like, I would like to land this financial stuff, which is actually pretty straightforward, so that we can then move on to what I think is the more important, interesting, and very pressing use case, because I saw AI coming. And
I'm actually
right? Yeah.
going to just push you a little bit here, because this is something I'm thinking a lot about as somebody who's very interested in space policy. So, I think our views of the administration are probably reasonably well aligned, that this is a deeply corrupt administration, and even specifically around cryptocurrency, even more so. However, isn't this still a time when you could potentially get the right things done for the wrong reason? Couldn't you
What a great question. Yeah.
build what you were talking about, even under sort of unfortunate circumstances?
Yeah. Yes, always is the answer, right? It takes a different approach, a different style. It's easier in some ways, harder in some ways. I left because I saw the naivete. I'm going to be very, this is going to sound very arrogant, but I saw the naivete of the industry. The idea that you could somehow have a president who was going to be there for you because you had done a thing as a small industry relative to bigger industry. I just thought that was bananas. And I was watching major industry players embrace MAGA, just embrace it wholeheartedly. Not just be opportunistic about it, like many have been, not just be resigned to it, like many have been, and I respect, right, whatever it is, but really like lean into this. And you had like crypto CEOs weighing in on DEI is terrible and merit-based hiring, and I'm like, what, right? Stick to what are you doing? So it was this, and I was like, I am not here for any of this. This is not, I refuse to be affiliated with that. I just will not do it. And so this became more and more and more dominant as a discussion point, to the point that the number of Democrats were fleeing to group chats, right? To be like, oh my God, what is happening in this industry? It was like, did they always believe this stuff and now it's coming to light? Or is it opportunistic? Like, how do you read it, right? And I can tell you it was a mixed bag. There were some people that were like, I have always held these views. We'll call them like Bill Ackman types, people. And now, oh my gosh, there's going to be this guy who's going to like, yes, like we should be doing blah, 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 blah. Things that were, again, completely unrelated to the topic at hand and the job that I was doing in that job, but were absolutely abhorrent to me personally. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to be around that,
So does that change how you reflect on your time? And just to put as sharp a point as possible, you worked in ways that empowered people who think you and your family are the problem, that there are too many Indian immigrants and people with brown skin, and they are now working to make sure that there's less, and that there's, frankly, more people who look like Harrison and myself as a proportion of the population. This podcast has gone completely off the rails. I apologize to our listeners, but sometimes I have the conversations that I want to have and I'm interested in. So how does that, affect how you reflect back on the work that you did at the CCI?
Yeah. So the good news is, the people that were funding us and that were kind of core to us are not those people. Now, there are people who were happy to go along to get along, which is its own problem, okay? But they were not out there overtly saying these kinds of things that you're saying, which certainly not isolated to any one industry. And I would argue,
Hmm.
many, many sectors of society have unfortunately come to, this place, right? This political place for varying reasons, for a variety of reasons. Okay. But it has localized a lot on sort of tech talent with H-1Bs and whatnot, which is, obviously personal to anybody of Indian descent or Indian heritage, even those of us born in America. I think that, I was lucky in that it never felt personal to me in that way. Right. But I will tell you, after it became widely known, which was never a secret, that I was a Democrat, I got death threats on Twitter. Okay, I had people like threatening me, doxing me, like all this, nonsense, simply because I was a Democrat. And now I was a Democrat who was calling out the Biden administration repeatedly about their flawed approach, which I still maintain was a very flawed approach to technology in general, by the way, but also this technology specifically, quite loudly, and using my platform along with a co-author, a white man, funnily enough. We wrote a series of op-eds, like all this stuff. So I was very vocal in my, in what I saw challenging there. Okay. Look, you're in public positions, you get the stuff all the time. It comes at you all over the place, right? You put yourself out there, people are always going to be, there's always going to be haters, and you just kind of ignore. But when it moves to death threat territory, it's very different,
Hmm.
right? Now, that's not why I left that job. I didn't leave because of death threats, because I'm not going to be bullied that way. But, I left because I was like, I just don't want to be, I had to be the face of the entire industry. Even though we had members, we had a very clean line about who was in and who was not, and who I was actually representing and who I was not. And for me, I was representing users at all times.
Hmm.
My frame was I'm representing the users of the technology, period, full stop. And the companies who were funding us, et cetera, had massive numbers of users. So that was a very, that was a very plausible and reasonable thing, right? And that's how I framed it to them, and they understood that. And we were all, aligned on that. But when you are the face of an industry, you don't get to pick and choose. And so in the public perception, all of these Yahoo rando, whack jobs were like also people that I was somehow representing. And I was like, that I'm very uncomfortable with that, because it's not true. And I would never do that. And also, like, I absolutely don't want to be affiliated there. And as the industry became more and more associated with just MAGA politics and MAGA on not just immigration, but on women, on all these pronatalism, like all this stuff became kind of like crypto, pilled, right? And affiliated. I was
Yeah.
like, none of that works for me at all. And so that is not a thing to be. Now, to this day, I still get phone calls on the bills that are going through from everybody I want to talk to. But I speak for myself only. I represent nobody in those conversations, but I get called, I get the reporters, I get the staffers, I get the senators, I get everybody coming out, I get the banks, I get everybody being like, what do you think? And so I'm still, honestly, when we want to get back to power, I'm actually more powerful in my role now, right, than I almost was then, when what I was saying was mitigated by the optics of what I
Mm.
represented. And now there's no illusion about that. I don't represent any of that. I just say exactly, and I've always said what I think all along, but now there's no question mark on that, right? Which is something I had not necessarily, I thought that once I was out of that job, I'd be kind of out of the game or whatever, but like, not true, not at all. So it's been a very interesting realization.
So, one of the things I learned at the World Economic Forum was from Timothy, and that is how to wrap up a phone call. And the way you do it is you say, I really want to be respectful of your time. And so, to that effect, I have a question that I'd love to ask you. I realize we're getting close to the end of time. It's actually not, the technically friends question that we always ask. I am assuming that you're a friend of ours because I know you don't have to. Um, but I guess my question is really like, you have youngish kids, right? I have youngish kids. Timothy has youngish kids, and then this is something I think we all talk about and compare, like the responsibility we feel to them to provide a world, specifically in technology, that, hopefully allows them to flourish and become better humans and interact with the world in a better way. For you, being in this world that you do have some power in and policy influence and things, how does that manifest for you? Like, what are you focused on fixing or changing? Do you feel that responsibility? And if there was one sort of element of this that you'd love to change, just if you got to make a wish and say this was better for my kids in technology, what would that be?
And it's a very easy question. And it's what I'm focusing most of my energy on at the moment, which we have not talked about at all, which is privacy. So we teach our kids from a very young age just basic OPSEC, like operational security, how to keep a password safe, what you share with whom and when, if you have a camera up, like what you do with it. Like we just teach this as part of our going about our day, kind of thing. I actually think some of the well-intentioned erosion of privacy that has emerged is actually very dangerous. Now, go back again. I think the through line and what we talked about today and what I care about and what I've always cared about is, these edge cases, as people call them, of activist use. Okay. But that's expanded. So over the last, few years, you now see activists who are trying to get an abortion. You see activists who are trying to protest ICE in the United States. These are activists that people wouldn't normally think about. And I would say these are just regular citizens going about their business. And so the erosion of privacy, which came about because of like kid safety and, predators and all these things, which are, again, true and harmful and horrible. But I think where the rubber meets the road is as a parent, you kind of balance that and you say, like, I am aware, of like, kids have been very harmed by some of this activity. And I have no illusions about the absolutely disgusting things that happen with CSAM. Like, I'm very aware of these things to a degree I wish I weren't, honestly. But I also think you have to balance that with what is your default setting, when you're engaging in an interaction. And so to me, I think preserving privacy in those interactions and limiting surveillance, whether surveillance by a company or surveillance by a government, is actually how we preserve our democracy and our First Amendment and other amendment rights. And you can't do that without a foundational layer of privacy. And we can go back in Malloyer to Griswold and all these cases that established a penumbral right to privacy, as it's called, in our Constitution, that are being eroded very rapidly in real time. And so I have a big issue with this idea that, a lot of the brightest minds in the Valley, and this has always been true going back to DARPA days, but a lot of the brightest minds in the Valley are now, their technology is being leveraged very knowingly and out in the open to surveil citizens and residents of the United States. I have a huge issue with this. And so that is the number one thing that I think dehumanizes us. I think when you are an object of that kind of surveillance and you don't have the ability to kind of make agency in your own movements or your own activities, I think that is like a huge issue. And it's part of what I felt aligned with the crypto community, which part of the community still has that orientation. A lot of it doesn't, right? So yeah, that's how I'd answer your question. And I think it's really relevant to how I'm raising my girls, how I'm thinking about their activities and just kind of like what it means to be a young woman, a brown woman, in America in 2026 is not trending great. Okay. So, how do you make sense of that is something I wrestle with literally every single day.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I know that that's like a personal element of this and really appreciate just your thoughtfulness and joining us. It's always great to chat with you. Timothy, do you have any final thoughts or questions before we wrap up?
Unfortunately, I have a hard stop as well. My wife's coming out of surgery and I should probably go pick her up. Not as a routine thing, but to me, this feels like a part one and that we could have gone for another hour. So once you land your next thing, I would say maybe you can be our first returning guest because we didn't actually even get to half the questions that I had for you.
I thought we were going to talk about leadership and
we were. I'm so sorry. I thought we took it in the wrong direction.
Right. Look, we're not just technically friends, we're actually friends. So, any chance I get to chat with the two of you, it always makes me think as well. And so, I appreciate the questions and the pushing because it's these are not easy times. I'll give you a platitude at the end here, but these are not easy times. And I think, I really feel like the thick, bold line is people who are wrestling with these questions that don't have answers, really, people who are just not. And so I'm grateful that I think all of our colleagues from that time together, you two certainly, we are wrestling with these very hard, thorny, difficult questions as people, as parents, as professionals, as citizens, as all the things. And so getting a chance to kind of do this with the two of you is really helpful to me too, right? Because it's not often you get to talk about these things apart from with your spouse or maybe your best friends. And so if this is useful to others to listen, I trust your judgment on that. If it's useful, then hey, happy to do it.
Thank you so much.
For sure.
Cheers.
Cheers. Two things, actually.
Yeah, hopefully it's okay.
Yeah.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.